You think you've understood the problem now. You tell yourself you just need to trust slower, observe more, be more careful. But this is exactly where most people fall into the second trap without realizing it. Because they start watching others, but they never question what's happening inside themselves. And that's where the real blind spot lies. Because even when you try to slow down, there's still a part of you that wants to feel certain about someone quickly. You want clarity. You want to know, is this person safe or not? And that desire pushes you to make decisions before you actually have enough evidence. So instead of trusting too fast, you start judging too fast, and both lead to the same outcome. You give the wrong people access, just in a different way. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because the issue isn't just about other people's behavior. It's about how your mind fills in the gaps when you don't have enough information. You don't like uncertainty, so you create a story. If someone is nice twice, you assume they're a good person. If they listen well, you assume they care. If they show up once, you assume they're reliable. And these assumptions feel logical in the moment. But they're built on incomplete patterns, and incomplete patterns lead to false confidence. And false confidence is what makes you lower your guard again, just in a more subtle way. But here's the part that most people misunderstand. And this is where everything shifts if you actually see it. You don't trust people because they've proven themselves. You trust them because you've decided they fit a role in your mind. You label them early, friend, ally, someone you can rely on. And once that label is there, your brain starts filtering everything they do through it. You ignore contradictions. You downplay red flags. You justify behavior that doesn't match. Not because you're unaware, but because you don't want to be wrong about your initial judgment. And this is the twist that changes everything. The biggest mistake isn't trusting too early. It's committing to your first impression and defending it without realizing it. And once you do that, you stop observing objectively. You're no longer watching who they are. You're protecting the idea you've created about them. And that's exactly when control slips away again. Because now they don't have to convince you anymore. You're convincing yourself. And people who know how to take advantage of others don't need to be perfect. They just need to be consistent enough to keep your story alive. They give you just enough to reinforce your belief, and you do the rest. You fill in the gaps, you maintain the illusion. And this is why you can feel something is off, and still stay. Because your logic is no longer based on reality. It's based on the version of them you've already accepted. And until you break that pattern, slowing down won't fully protect you, because you'll still be deciding too early, just in a quieter way. And here's what starts to separate people who keep getting used from those who don't. It's not that they're better at spotting others instantly. It's that they refuse to finalize any judgment too soon. They stay in observation mode longer than feels comfortable. They allow uncertainty to exist without rushing to resolve it. And that's difficult, because your mind will keep pushing you to decide, to label, to feel secure. But real control comes from resisting that urge, from letting patterns reveal themselves over time without interference. And most people never develop that patience, which is why they keep repeating the same cycle, thinking they've changed, when in reality they've only changed the speed, not the process. And if you don't see this distinction, you'll keep making the same mistake in a different form, thinking you've improved, while the outcome stays exactly the same. Now you're starting to see the pattern. But the real reason this keeps happening to you goes deeper than just timing or observation. It's rooted in how your mind is wired to protect you. And ironically, that protection is exactly what puts you at risk, because your brain is not designed to detect manipulation in the early stages. It's designed to create connection as fast as possible, especially when you feel understood. Because from a psychological level, feeling understood signals safety, and when your brain senses safety, it lowers your defenses automatically without asking for permission. And that's the moment everything shifts without you noticing, because you're no longer evaluating the person in front of you. You're reacting to how they make you feel, and feelings are not reliable indicators of intent. They're reflections of your internal state. And this is where most people lose control without realizing it, because they believe they're making conscious decisions, when in reality they're responding to emotional cues that were triggered intentionally or unintentionally by the other person. And here's where it gets even more subtle. Because once that emotional connection is established, your brain activates something called confirmation bias, which means you start looking for evidence that supports your initial belief about that person, and you ignore anything that contradicts it. Not because you're unaware, but because Your mind is trying to maintain consistency. It wants your perception to feel stable, predictable, safe, so it filters out anything that threatens that stability. And this is why you can notice small red flags and still stay, because your brain reframes them into something harmless. You tell yourself, they didn't mean it like that, or everyone has bad days, or maybe I'm overthinking. And each time you do that, you're not just excusing their behavior, you're reinforcing your own blind spot. And over time, that blind spot becomes stronger than your awareness. And this is the mechanism that keeps you stuck in the same cycle with different people, because the pattern isn't external. It's internal. It's how you process signals, how you assign meaning, how you protect your own emotional comfort. But here's the part most people never fully understand. And this is where everything changes if you really see it. The people who end up being used the most are not the weakest. They are the ones who value connection the most. They are the ones who are willing to give, to listen, to open up. And those qualities are not flaws. But without control, they become vulnerabilities. Because when you prioritize connection over clarity, you sacrifice your ability to see things objectively. You start choosing how you want things to be over how they actually are. And that gap between perception and reality is where manipulation lies. Not always intentional, but always effective. And this is why simply telling yourself to be more careful never works long term. Because you're not addressing the root mechanism, which is your need to feel certain about people quickly, your discomfort with ambiguity, your tendency to resolve uncertainty by creating meaning too soon. And until you learn to sit with that uncertainty without rushing to fill it, you'll keep repeating the same pattern, just with different faces, different situations, different outcomes that feel slightly different but come from the same core process. And this is where the shift begins, not in how you see others, but in how you regulate your own reactions. Because the moment you stop reacting to how someone makes you feel immediately and start questioning what is actually consistent over time, you begin to take control back, not by changing who you are, but by changing when you decide. And that timing is the difference between being used and staying in control. Imagine this happening in a normal, everyday situation. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just something so common that most people never question it. You meet someone at work, maybe a new coworker. Let's call her Jessica. She's friendly, easy to talk to. She remembers small details about you, asks about your weekend, laughs at your jokes, and within a few days, it feels like you've known her for months. And that feeling, that's where it starts, because your mind tells you this is safe. So you begin to open up, just a little at first. You share that you've been stressed, maybe mention a project you're struggling with, maybe even talk about your boss or something that's been frustrating you. And Jessica listens, nods, agrees. She even shares something personal back, just enough to make it feel mutual. And now there's a sense of trust forming, not because time has passed, but because the emotional exchange feels balanced. But here's what you don't see in that moment. You're building trust based on how the interaction feels, not on how consistent her behavior has been over time. And that difference is everything. Because a week later, something small happens. Maybe you notice she brings up something you told her in a meeting, not directly, not obviously, but just enough to shift how others see the situation, and you feel a slight discomfort. Something feels off, but you brush it away, telling yourself, it's probably nothing, because your brain is still protecting the image you've built of her. And this is the exact mechanism we talked about earlier. You're not ignoring the signal because you didn't notice it. You're ignoring it because it doesn't match the story you've already accepted. So you continue as normal, still friendly, still open, still trusting. And over time, small moments like that start to stack up. Not enough to create a clear problem, but enough to create a pattern. And by the time the pattern becomes obvious, the damage is already done, because now your words, your thoughts, your frustrations have already been shared, and they've already shaped how others see you. And you're left trying to figure out when things shifted, when the trust broke, when the situation changed. But the truth is, it didn't change suddenly. It was built slowly, piece by piece, through moments you didn't take seriously enough at the time. And this isn't just about work. The same pattern shows up in friendships, relationships, even casual conversations. You meet someone who seems to get you. You feel comfortable quickly. You open up faster than usual, and everything feels natural. Until later, when something doesn't add up, when their actions don't match what you expected, and you feel confused. Not because the signs weren't there, but because you didn't give yourself enough time to see them clearly. And here's the part that most people don't realize. It's not that Jessica was necessarily planning anything from the beginning. It's that by giving her access too early, you removed your own ability to evaluate her objectively. You moved from observation to involvement too quickly, and once you're involved, your perception changes. You're no longer neutral, you're invested, and that investment makes it harder to step back, harder to question, harder to adjust, and that's how control slips away. Not through one big mistake, but through a series of small decisions that felt right in the moment. And if you look closely, you'll start to recognize this pattern in your own life. Not just with one person, but across different situations, different faces, the same sequence repeating itself. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. But the real question is whether you'll catch it early enough next time, before the pattern finishes playing out again. So now you see the pattern clearly. You see how it starts, how it builds, how it slowly turns into something you can't control anymore. And the natural reaction is to protect yourself, to tell yourself, I'll just stop trusting people so easily. Or even, I won't open up at all anymore. But that's not the real solution, and deep down you already know that, because becoming closed off doesn't make you smarter. It just makes you isolated, and isolation creates a different kind of problem. One where you lose opportunities, connections, and even the ability to read people accurately over time. So the goal is not to trust less, it's to trust differently. And this is where the shift begins, not in what you give, but in when you give it. Because control doesn't come from holding everything back, it comes from controlling the pace at which you reveal yourself. And this is something most people never learn. They think trust is a yes or no decision, but in reality, it's a gradual process. It should unfold in layers, and each layer should be based on observed behavior, not emotional comfort. So instead of asking yourself, do I trust this person? You start asking a different question, one that changes everything. What has this person consistently shown me so far? And at first, this feels slow, even uncomfortable, because your mind still wants to jump ahead. It wants certainty. It wants to label. It wants to feel secure, but you resist that urge. You stay in observation mode longer than feels natural, and this alone filters out more risk than most people realize, because the wrong people rely on speed. They rely on your willingness to move quickly, to open up quickly, to commit to an idea of them before they've had to prove anything real. And when you remove that speed, something interesting happens. Their behavior starts to reveal more than their words ever could. Small inconsistencies become clearer, patterns become easier to detect, and most importantly, you begin to notice how they act when there's nothing to gain. Because that's where intention shows itself, not in moments of connection, but in moments of neutrality. And this is the first layer of control, learning to separate what feels good from what is actually reliable. But here's where most people still get it wrong. And this is subtle, because even when they slow down, they still look for big signs, obvious red flags, something clear enough to justify pulling back. But real awareness doesn't work like that. It doesn't rely on obvious signals. It comes from noticing the small patterns that most people ignore, the way someone responds when you set a boundary, the way they handle something that doesn't benefit them, the way their behavior shifts when attention is no longer on them. And these details don't stand out immediately. They require time, patience, and a willingness to stay uncertain longer than you're used to. And that's the part most people struggle with. Because uncertainty feels uncomfortable, it feels like a lack of control, but in reality, it's the opposite. It's where control begins, because the moment you stop rushing to resolve uncertainty, you give yourself space to see things clearly, and clarity is what protects you. Not assumptions, not feelings, not first impressions. But there's one more layer to this that most people never fully understand, and this is where the real difference is made. Because even if you observe carefully, even if you slow everything down, there's still a specific pattern that separates people who stay in control from those who eventually lose it again. And it's not obvious. It's not something people talk about openly. But once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. And more importantly, you start catching it early enough to change the outcome before it repeats itself. The reason this works is not just because it makes you more careful. It works because it interrupts the exact psychological mechanism that usually causes you to lose control in the first place. Because when you slow the pace of trust, You create distance between emotion and decision, and that distance is everything. Because most people do not get hurt at the moment they meet the wrong person. They get hurt at the moment they make a decision while under the influence of emotional comfort. And emotional comfort is powerful because it feels like truth. It feels like evidence. It feels like clarity. But it is none of those things. It is simply a temporary internal state. And when you make important judgments from that state, you are not reading the other person clearly. You are reading your own need to feel safe, connected, or understood. And that is why slowing down changes the entire equation. Because it prevents one good feeling from gaining too much authority over your judgment. It forces the mind to gather more data before it forms a conclusion. And once you do that, the brain begins to rely less on impression and more on pattern. And patterns are much harder to fake than impressions. Because anyone can perform well in the beginning. Anyone can be attentive for a few conversations, say the right things for a few days, present the right image for a few moments. But very few people can maintain integrity across time, context, pressure, and inconvenience. And this is why observation is more powerful than instinct in the early stages. Because instinct is fast, and speed is exactly where your blind spot lies. But here is the deeper reason this method protects you. It changes who has to do the work. When you trust too early, you do the work for them. You fill in the blanks. You justify their inconsistencies. You create the meaning. You keep the relationship moving forward in your own mind. But when you slow down, they have to do the work. They have to show consistency. They have to reveal their character through repetition. They have to earn access through behavior instead of receiving it through charm. And that one shift alone gives you far more control than most people realize. Because now you are no longer trying to detect deception directly, which is difficult. You are simply waiting long enough for reality to become more visible. And reality always becomes visible with time, especially when there is nothing to gain. Because this is another reason the solution works. It removes performance from the center of your decision-making. When someone is trying to make an impression, their behavior is strategic. It is shaped by what they want you to see. But when there is no immediate reward, no attention, no advantage, their behavior becomes less managed, more natural, more revealing. And that is where the truth usually appears, not in intense moments, not in emotional conversations, but in ordinary moments that seem too small to matter. And most people miss those moments because they are waiting for something dramatic. But the smartest people do the opposite. They watch the ordinary details, because they understand that character leaks through routine long before it explodes in crisis. And this is also why the solution feels uncomfortable at first, because it goes against the brain's natural desire for closure. Your mind wants to know, wants to define, wants to settle the uncertainty quickly. And when you refuse to do that, it feels like tension. But that tension is not a problem. It is actually a sign that you are no longer allowing your emotions to rush the process. You are building tolerance for uncertainty, and that tolerance is one of the strongest forms of social intelligence a person can develop, because the people who get used the least are rarely the coldest or the most suspicious. They are the ones who can stay neutral long enough to see clearly. They do not need immediate answers. They do not need instant certainty. They do not hand out meaning too soon. And because of that, they see what others miss. But there is still one piece of this that makes the whole strategy truly effective. And without it, even patient people can still get drawn into the same pattern again. Because observation alone is not enough if you do not know exactly what kind of pattern you are supposed to be watching for. At this point, it sounds simple. Slow down, observe longer, don't trust too fast. And most people hear that and think they've already understood it. They tell themselves, I'll just be more careful next time. But this is exactly where almost everyone makes the next mistake without realizing it. Because they turn observation into a passive activity. They watch, they wait, they pay attention, but they don't change the way they interact. And that's where the real gap is, because observation alone doesn't reveal everything. People can maintain a controlled image for a long time if nothing challenges it. And this is the twist most people completely miss. The truth about someone doesn't just show up over time. It shows up when something disrupts their control. And if you never create that disruption, you may still end up trusting the wrong person, just more slowly. And that feels safer, but it leads to the same outcome, just delayed. And here's why. Because most people behave well when everything is easy, when there's no pressure, no resistance, no inconvenience. They can be patient, kind, consistent, but that version of them is incomplete. It's not fake, but it's not fully tested either. And if you base your trust only on that version, you're still missing critical information. And this is where the real shift happens, because the people who stay in control don't just observe passively. They pay attention to how someone reacts when things don't go their way, when a boundary is introduced, when expectations are not met, when they don't get immediate access. And this is where behavior starts to change, not always dramatically, but subtly enough that most people ignore it. Maybe their tone shifts, maybe their patience shortens, maybe they become slightly less consistent. And if you're not paying attention to those moments, you'll miss the most important signals, because those signals don't appear when everything is smooth. They appear when there's friction, and friction is uncomfortable, which is why most people avoid creating it. They don't want to say no, they don't want to delay, they don't want to set limits too early because they fear it will damage the connection. But here's the reality most people never accept. A connection that can't handle small resistance is not stable enough to trust. And avoiding that resistance doesn't protect the relationship. It hides its weaknesses until it's too late. And this is why simply waiting and watching is not enough. Because without moments of friction, you're only seeing one side of a person, the side they choose to show when things are in their favor. And that's not where real patterns are revealed. Real patterns emerge when expectations are not met, when they don't get what they want immediately, when they have to adjust, compromise, or respect a boundary they didn't set. And this is the part that feels uncomfortable, because now you're no longer just observing. You're influencing the situation slightly. You're introducing small moments that reveal more information, and most people hesitate here because they think they're being difficult or distant. But they're not. They're creating clarity, and clarity is what prevents you from giving trust too early. Because once you see how someone reacts under even a small amount of pressure, you gain insight that no amount of surface-level interaction can give you. And this is the difference between thinking you understand someone and actually understanding them. But here's the deeper twist that most people still don't catch. Even when they start noticing these reactions, they often interpret them emotionally instead of objectively. They feel disappointed, they feel confused, they feel uncertain. And then they either pull away too quickly or ignore it completely, instead of doing the one thing that actually keeps them in control, and that is understanding what those reactions actually mean over time, not in one moment, not in isolation, but as part of a larger pattern that is still forming. Think about a situation that feels completely normal, something so ordinary you wouldn't question it at all. You're texting someone you've recently gotten close to. Maybe it started as casual conversation. Then it slowly became more frequent, more personal. They check in on you, ask how your day went, remember small details you mentioned, and over time, it feels like they genuinely care, like they're paying attention in a way most people don't, and that feeling pulls you in. So you respond more, you share more, you start prioritizing those conversations because they feel easy, natural, almost automatic. But then something small shifts, not enough to alarm you, just enough to feel slightly off. Maybe one day you don't reply right away, you're busy, or you just don't feel like talking, and instead of staying neutral, they react, not aggressively, not obviously, but subtly. They say something like, "I guess you're too busy for me now," or "You've been different lately." And it's said in a light tone, almost like a joke, but it lands heavier than it should, and now you feel a small sense of pressure, a need to explain, to reassure, to fix the moment. So you respond quicker next time. You adjust your behavior without even realizing it. And this is where the pattern begins to form, because what just happened wasn't random. It was a shift in control, and you didn't notice it because it didn't look like control. It looked like emotion, like vulnerability, like someone just expressing how they feel. But here's what's actually happening underneath. Your behavior is being shaped by their reactions, not by your own choices. And the more this repeats, the more you start anticipating their response. You reply faster, you share more carefully, you adjust your tone. Not because you decided to, but because you want to avoid that subtle discomfort again. And this is how manipulation works in real life. Not through force, not through obvious pressure, but through small emotional cues that guide your behavior over time. And here's the part that most people completely miss. You think you're being considerate. You think you're just maintaining the connection. But what you're actually doing is training yourself to prioritize their emotional reactions over your own boundaries. And once that happens, the dynamic changes, because now they don't have to ask for control, you're giving it automatically. And this pattern shows up everywhere, not just in texting, but in friendships, in group settings, in everyday interactions. Someone makes a small comment when you say no. Someone acts slightly distant when you don't agree. Someone withdraws attention when you don't respond the way they expect. And each time, you adjust just a little, and those small adjustments build over time, until you're no longer acting freely. You're reacting predictably. And the most dangerous part is, it still feels like you're in control, because nothing dramatic has happened. There's no clear conflict, no obvious red flag, just a series of moments that felt easier to smooth over than to question. But if you step back and look at the pattern, you start to see it differently. You start to notice how often your actions are influenced by avoiding someone else's reaction, how often you explain more than necessary, respond faster than you intended, or hold back something you wanted to say just to keep things smooth. And that's the moment where clarity begins, because once you see that your behavior is being shaped in these small, consistent ways, you realize the situation isn't as neutral as it felt, and more importantly, you realize how easily this pattern can repeat with different people if you don't recognize it early, because it doesn't start with something obvious. It starts with something that feels normal, comfortable, even positive, and by the time it feels wrong, you're already inside the pattern, trying to understand how it happened instead of noticing when it began. If you don't change this pattern, the consequences don't show up all at once. They build slowly, quietly, until one day you realize something feels off about your life, but you can't point to a single moment where it went wrong, because it was never one big mistake. It was a series of small decisions that felt harmless at the time. And that's what makes it dangerous, because you don't feel like you're losing control. You feel like you're maintaining relationships, being understanding, being flexible, being easy to get along with. But over time, those small adjustments start to reshape how people treat you, because people don't just respond to what you say, they respond to what you allow. And when you consistently adjust yourself to avoid discomfort, you teach others that your boundaries are flexible, that your time is negotiable, that your reactions can be influenced. And most of this happens without anyone saying it out loud. It's learned through repetition, through patterns, through the way you respond in moments that seem too small to matter. And this is where the long-term effect begins to take shape, because once people recognize that pattern, even subconsciously, they begin to rely on it. They expect you to adapt, to accommodate, to smooth things over. And the more you do it, the harder it becomes to stop, because now you're not just changing your behavior. You're disrupting an expectation that's already been built, and that creates tension, and most people avoid that tension, so they continue the pattern, even when they start to feel the cost of it. And that cost doesn't just show up in how others treat you. It shows up in how you see yourself. Because every time you override your own instinct to keep things smooth, you weaken your ability to trust your own judgment. You start second-guessing what you feel, questioning whether you're overreacting, minimizing things that actually matter, and over time, that creates a subtle kind of confusion, where you're no longer sure when to speak up, when to hold back, when something is genuinely wrong or just uncomfortable. And that confusion makes you easier to influence, because now your internal signals are less clear, less reliable. And when your internal signals are unclear, you start relying more on external reactions to guide your behavior, which puts you even further out of control. And this is how the cycle sustains itself, not because people are constantly trying to take advantage of you, but because your pattern makes it easy for them to do so without resistance. And the longer this continues, the more it affects your opportunities, your decisions, even your relationships, because you may start attracting the same type of dynamic again and again, different people, different situations, but the same underlying pattern, where you give too much too soon, adjust too quickly, and realize too late. And by that point, you're not just dealing with one situation. You're dealing with the accumulated effect of many, and that's when frustration builds. When you start asking why this keeps happening, why things don't change, why you feel like you're always the one adapting. But the answer is not in any single interaction. It's in the system you've been following without realizing it. And unless that system changes, the outcome won't change either, no matter how different the people or the situation may seem on the surface. At some point, You realize that just avoiding mistakes is not enough. You don't just want to stop being used, you want to understand how to stay in control no matter who you're dealing with. And that requires a different level of thinking, because most people operate on a simple rule. They react to what happens, but people who stay in control operate on a different rule entirely. They anticipate how situations will evolve based on patterns, not moments. And this is where the next principle comes in, one that most people never fully develop, because it requires you to shift from reacting emotionally to evaluating strategically. And that principle is this: never respond to the moment. Respond to the pattern behind the moment, because a single interaction can be misleading. Anyone can have a bad day. Anyone can say the wrong thing once. Anyone can act differently under certain circumstances, but patterns don't lie. Patterns reveal priorities, consistency, and intention over time. And when you train yourself to focus on patterns instead of isolated moments, your decisions become much more stable, much less influenced by temporary emotions, and much harder for others to manipulate. But here's where most people misunderstand this principle. They think they need more time to see patterns clearly. And while time helps, it's not just about time. It's about what you pay attention to during that time, because patterns are not always obvious. They don't always show up in big ways. They show up in repetition, in small behaviors that seem insignificant on their own, but become meaningful when they repeat under different conditions. And this is where awareness becomes a skill, not just a reaction, because instead of asking, was that good or bad, you start asking, is this consistent with what I've seen before? And that question changes everything, because it forces you to compare behavior across time instead of reacting to one moment. And this naturally slows down your decisions. But more importantly, it strengthens your judgment, because now you're not relying on how something feels. You're relying on how something holds up over multiple situations. And this is where control begins to feel different. It's no longer about protecting yourself from others. It's about understanding how behavior works so you don't get pulled into patterns that don't serve you. But there's another layer to this principle that makes it even more powerful. And this is where it becomes a real advantage. Because once you start seeing patterns, you also start seeing predictability, and predictability allows you to anticipate how someone is likely to act before they actually do it. Not because you're guessing, but because their past behavior has already shown you the direction. And when you can anticipate behavior, you stop being surprised, you stop reacting late, you start adjusting earlier. And that's what keeps you in control, not reacting faster, but recognizing sooner. And this is why people who understand patterns rarely feel blindsided, because they've already seen the signs long before the outcome becomes obvious. But here's the part most people still don't fully grasp. Even when they start recognizing patterns, they often hesitate to act on them. They see the inconsistency, they notice the shift, they feel something is off, but they wait for something clearer, something more obvious, something that justifies a stronger reaction. And in that waiting, they give the pattern more time to affect them, more time to influence the situation, more time to shape the outcome. And that hesitation usually comes from one place: the fear of being wrong, the fear of misjudging someone, the fear of reacting too early. But the reality is, waiting for absolute certainty is what keeps most people stuck, because certainty comes too late. It arrives after the pattern has already played out, after the cost has already been paid. And this is where the principle becomes practical, not just theoretical, because it's not about being perfect in your judgment. It's about being early enough to adjust your behavior before the pattern becomes a problem. And that adjustment doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be confrontational. It can be subtle, controlled, and measured, but it has to happen at the right time. And most people miss that timing because they're still looking for something bigger, something clearer, something undeniable, when in reality, the smartest decisions are often made based on signals that are still forming, signals that are not fully obvious yet, but consistent enough to guide your next move, and learning to trust those early patterns without overreacting. That's where the real skill begins, and most people never get to that level because they either react too quickly or wait too long, without realizing there's a middle point where control actually exists. At this point, if you step back and look at everything clearly, you start to realize something most people never fully understand. This was never just about trusting the wrong person. It was about how you were making decisions without seeing the full process behind them. Because every situation you've been in followed a pattern, not random, not bad luck, but a sequence. You felt something, you assumed something, you decided something, and then you reacted based on that decision. And the outcome always came from that chain, not from a single moment. And once you see that, everything changes. Because now you're no longer focused on fixing isolated situations, you're focused on understanding the system that creates those situations in the first place. And that system is built on three things most people never separate clearly: what you feel, what you assume, and what you verify. And the reason people lose control is because they collapse those three into one. They feel something and treat it as truth. They assume something and treat it as fact. And they skip verification completely. And when you do that, you're not actually reading reality, you're reacting to your own interpretation of it. And that's why the same pattern keeps repeating, because your interpretation hasn't changed, even if the people have. But once you separate those layers, you start to see things differently. You can feel something without believing it immediately. You can notice an assumption without committing to it. And you can wait for patterns to confirm or contradict what you think. And that separation gives you space. And that space is where control lives, because now you're not forced to react instantly. You're choosing when and how to respond. And that's a completely different position than most people operate from. Because most people are reacting in real time, adjusting in real time, adapting in real time, without realizing they're being influenced in real time. But when you step out of that, when you slow down the process, when you observe patterns instead of moments, when you create small amounts of friction instead of avoiding it, when you allow uncertainty to exist instead of rushing to resolve it, you begin to operate from a place that feels unfamiliar at first, but becomes stronger over time. And here's the shift that defines everything. You stop trying to figure out who someone is based on how they make you feel, and you start understanding who they are based on how they behave across different situations. And that difference may seem subtle, but it changes every outcome, because feelings can be influenced quickly, but behavior patterns take time to reveal. And when you base your decisions on patterns, you naturally avoid situations that would have pulled you in before, not because you're more guarded, but because you're more precise, and precision is what replaces guesswork. And once guesswork is gone, most of the confusion disappears with it. But there's one more layer to this that most people don't fully accept, and this is where your awareness either stabilizes or collapses back into old habits. Because understanding all of this is one thing. Applying it consistently is something else. Especially in moments where emotions are strong, where the situation feels important, where the urge to respond quickly comes back. And that's where most people fall back into the same pattern, not because they didn't understand, but because they didn't control the moment where it mattered most. And that moment is where everything you've learned either holds or breaks. If everything up to this point makes sense, then the next step is not to change who you are. It's to change what you do in the exact moment where you usually lose control. Because that moment always looks small, almost insignificant, and that's why it slips past you. It's the moment you feel the urge to respond quickly, to explain yourself, to reassure someone, to fill the silence, to keep things smooth. And instead of reacting the way you normally would, you do something different, something that feels slightly unnatural at first. You pause, not for a long time, not in a dramatic way, just enough to break the automatic response. Because that pause is where your control begins, and most people never take it. They go straight from feeling to reacting, without creating any space in between, and that's why they keep repeating the same pattern. But when you pause, even briefly, you interrupt that chain. You give yourself a chance to observe instead of react, and what you do next becomes intentional instead of automatic. And this is the first action, not reacting immediately when you feel pressure, even if that pressure is subtle. Even if it feels like you should respond right away, you don't. You give it a moment, because that moment reveals more than you think. It shows you whether the situation actually requires a response, or if you're just responding to discomfort. And most of the time, it's the discomfort, not the situation, that's driving your behavior. And once you see that, you start to separate the two. And that separation changes how you move. But here's the second action that most people overlook. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop adding extra context just to make things feel smoother, because every time you explain more than necessary, you give away information that others can use to shape the interaction. You give them insight into your reasoning, your boundaries, your hesitation, and that creates openings you didn't intend to create. And this doesn't mean you become closed off. It means you become precise. You say what is needed, not everything that comes to mind. And that shift alone reduces how much influence others have over your decisions. But here's where it becomes more subtle, because even if you pause, even if you speak less, there's still one behavior that determines whether you stay in control or fall back into the same pattern. And that behavior is how you respond when something feels slightly off, not obviously wrong, not clearly a problem, just off. Because that's where most people betray their own awareness. They notice it, they feel it, but they ignore it because it's not strong enough to justify a reaction. So they continue as if nothing happened. And that's exactly how the pattern continues. Not because they didn't see it, but because they didn't act on it early enough. And this is where your next action comes in. You don't ignore those small signals anymore, but you also don't overreact to them. You adjust slightly. You create a little more distance. You observe a little longer. You give less access, not in a dramatic way, but in a controlled, measured way that keeps you neutral. And this is where most people feel uncertain, because they're used to either reacting fully or ignoring completely. And this middle ground feels unfamiliar. But this is where control actually exists, in those small adjustments that happen before anything becomes obvious, before anything becomes a problem. And if you can hold yourself in that space, if you can resist the urge to resolve everything immediately, you start to notice something change, not just in how others behave, but in how you experience situations. You feel less rushed, less pulled, less influenced by what's happening around you. And that shift is subtle, but it's the foundation of everything you've been building. Because once you can manage that moment consistently, you stop repeating the same pattern. But there's still one layer to this that most people don't fully apply, and it's the difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it when it matters most. At the end of all this, it starts to become clear that control was never about changing other people. It was never about predicting every outcome, and it was never about protecting yourself by becoming distant or closed off. It was always about one thing: how you manage the moment when your instinct tells you to react. Because that moment is where everything either repeats or changes. And most people don't lose control in obvious situations. They lose it in subtle ones, in conversations that feel normal, in interactions that seem harmless, in decisions that feel small. And that's why the pattern is so hard to break. Because it doesn't look like a pattern while it's happening. It just feels like life unfolding naturally. But now you see something different. You see that behind every natural reaction, there's a choice you didn't notice before, a moment where you could have paused, observed, adjusted. And that awareness changes how you experience everything moving forward, because you're no longer inside the pattern. You're watching it as it forms. And that distance gives you something most people never develop: the ability to respond instead of react, to delay instead of rush, to observe instead of assume. And over time, that changes the way people interact with you. Not because you force them to, but because you're no longer giving them the same access by default. You're no longer reinforcing the same patterns. And when those patterns are gone, the dynamics shift naturally. But here's where it becomes deeper than just behavior. Because as you start applying this, you'll notice something else, something that has nothing to do with other people. You'll notice how often your first instinct is driven by a need to feel certain, to feel understood, to feel in control of the situation immediately. And that need is what has been guiding your decisions more than you realized. Not logic, not awareness, but the desire to resolve uncertainty as fast as possible. And once you see that clearly, you begin to question something you never questioned before. Not, can I trust this person? But, why do I feel the need to decide that so quickly? And that question shifts the focus completely. Because now you're not just observing others. You're observing yourself in real time. Your reactions, your impulses, your patterns, and that level of awareness creates a different kind of control. One that doesn't depend on who you're dealing with, but on how you process what's happening. And this is where most people stop. They understand the surface, they apply some of the actions, but they never go deeper into that internal layer. And because of that, they improve temporarily, but eventually fall back into old patterns when the situation feels important enough, when the emotion is strong enough, when the desire to connect overrides the need to observe. And that's where the real test begins, not in calm situations, not in easy interactions, but in the exact moment when everything in you wants to go back to the old way, to respond quickly, to trust early, to resolve the uncertainty and move forward. And in that moment, there's no guide, no rule, no checklist, just awareness and a choice. And that choice determines everything that follows, not just in that situation, but in every pattern that comes after it. Because once you change that moment consistently, the entire system changes with it. And here's the part that most people never fully answer. Even after understanding all of this, when that moment comes again, and it will, when it feels right to trust, right to open up, right to move forward faster than you should, will you actually pause long enough to see what's really happening? Or will you go back to what feels familiar and call it instinct?